Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope that everyone is feeling great and that you're having a funky week wherever you are. Before we begin, I'd like to give my usual thanks, starting with the fabulous Andrew McLean for all the art that he has produced for this series. And I'd also like to thank my Patreons for their continued financial pledge. It really is much appreciated. I'm also going to mention the Hunger Games Discord, where games are created based on your decisions. The link for that is in the description. Whilst you're down there, feel free to have a look at the other links that are associated with this series. Now, the eagle-eyed ones of you might notice that this video is part 1 of the 95th Games. Part 2 will be on Wednesday at 9 PM GMT. I'm also going to be doing a Q&A at the end of that video, so underneath the pinned comment in this video, there should be one unless YouTube is being silly. Then feel free to leave any questions you would like to know the answer to. So, without further ado, let's go! The 95th Games took place in the year 107. In accordance with the Treaty of the Reclamation, every 5 years a special set of rules would be incorporated into the Hunger Games in a special set of the games known as a Quinquennial Quell. These games were used to remind the districts of the capital's continuous command over them. A week before these games began, President Gall made a live announcement on Capital TV, in which he stated the conditions for the 4th Quinquennial Quell. Gall announced that in order to remind the districts that each of their populations fought as one against the capital, every district will reap a pair of male tributes to fight as one, and a pair of female tributes to fight as one within the games. Although cheers immediately erupted within Snow Square, a wave of confusion was also clearly present, with many citizens asking each other what was meant by fighting as one. Several theories emerged over that day, with some believing that if one tribute died, the other's tracker would explode, and others speculated that one tribute would be sent into the arena and once they died, they would be replaced with the other tribute, while some even seemed quite certain that each pair would fight to the death and the winner of this duel would enter the arena. By the end of the second day, it was clear that Mirai and her entourage were rather tired from all the travelling between the outlying districts, but she remained professional nonetheless, and even seemed pleased to have arrived in District 7. Mirai was given a brief tour through the inner forests, before being asked to open a new lumber mill, which she chose to name after her former ally, Lilac Canham. Mirai was then led to the platform as the youths of this district, who were dressed in various shades of brown, waited in anticipation. She gave a brief speech about the benefits of being a victor, before picking the first name from the female reaping bowl, which she announced to be 16-year-old Hazel Branks. The camera soon found a girl in an old khaki dress, which Eugenia Ravenstill said was probably older than Hazel herself, but she also stated that the light brown bows through Hazel's fair hair at least added a dash of life. Tears were forming in Hazel's eyes, and she made no effort to stop them from falling as she made her way down the aisle and to the platform, before shaking hands with Mirai, who smiled warmly at her. As Hazel rubbed her eyes, Mirai chose the second name, which she announced to be 17-year-old Belsa Montague. Before the camera had even found her, one of the tallest girls in the enclosure was already making her way to the aisle, while showing no real expression. As Belsa walked to the platform, Enya Stilton discussed what she might really be feeling, before stating that it was rare for a tribute to show no emotion at all, such as in this case. Yet Eugenia joked that Belsa's small brown afro looked like Ennius's hair when he was reaped back in the 76th Hunger Games, a comment which he chose to ignore. Once on the platform, Belsa shook hands with Mirai and then Hazel, giving a nod of reassurance as she greeted the latter. Mirai then made her way over to the male reaping bowl and dug deep, before choosing 18-year-old Hawthorne Dalloway. The camera zoomed to the back of the male enclosure, and a good-looking young man with scruffy brown hair, who was only slightly taller than Belsa, breathed out in apparent frustration, whilst being consoled by his peers. He then marched out to the aisle, and as he made his way to the platform, Eugenia stated that she would like to swing his axe any day, with Ennius asking if this was necessary, and Eugenia insisting that she was only talking about Hawthorne's axe. His brow remained furrowed as he shook hands with Mirai, Belsa, and then Hazel, before standing on his side of the platform and continuing to smoulder. Mirai then picked out a final name and announced it to be 13-year-old Rowan Alfox. A petrified shudder was clearly heard coming from the relevant section of the enclosure, and the camera quickly focused on a short lad with slick blonde hair. Rowan immediately grabbed onto his peers, as if they could somehow help him, but they simply looked away or stepped back from Rowan's pleas for help. Peacekeepers entered the enclosure and dragged Rowan out. He was then carried over the back of one of the peacekeepers, whilst kicking and screaming that he did not want to die, before being practically thrown onto the platform, where another peacekeeper quickly grabbed him and wrestled him to his feet. During this time, Ennius casually remarked that this tribute was going to be fun to watch. As Rowan cried, Hawthorne looked at him like he was an annoying fly, before turning his head back to the enclosure ahead of him. Mirai then wished that the odds be in the population's favour, before heading with the newly reaped tributes and a group of peacekeepers into the town hall behind them. The tributes were given a brief goodbye period with their loved ones. Hazel promised her little sister, Olive, that she would come back and that she would not end up like Otis, which made Olive and their mother cry a little more. However, through her own tears, Hazel jokingly made Olive promise in return that she would make sure her mother behaved herself, which Olive agreed to, whilst letting out a slight laugh, although as Hazel embraced her, she was seen to give her mother a knowing look. Balsa's parents had died in a lumber mill explosion the previous year, but she was visited by her 5 siblings, all of whom were younger. She remained stoic, but told them what to do for future financial income if she did not make it back. It was only when Balsa finally saw her crying siblings leave that she let out some tears as well. As for Hawthorne, his parents were clearly sad to be seeing him enter the games, but he simply told his mother not to cry, and that he would do everything he could in order to make it back. Rowan, on the other hand, could not stop wailing, which seemed to trigger his mother into hysterics as well. Eventually, after it appeared that he was incapable of getting a word out of his mouth, Rowan's mother was dragged away, and he, along with the others, were escorted onto the train for the capital. The train began to move through the inner forests of District 7, and the AVOX present later reported that Hazel, Balsa, and Hawthorne solemnly introduced themselves to each other, before discussing what they thought was meant by each pair fighting as one. Meanwhile, Rowan was sat glumly in the corner, stating that he wanted to go home, which caused Hawthorne to snap at him that this was what they all wanted, but that the odds were clearly not in their favour, before telling Rowan that if they were supposed to rely on each other, he would not put up with his crying. This appeared to make Rowan even more upset, and Hazel stepped in to comfort him, although this did not have much of an effect, and simply made Hawthorne roll his eyes in frustration, whilst Balsa sat up and looked out the window at the passing trees. Hazel continued to hold Rowan's hand, and she told him that it's going to be okay. But seconds after saying this, a voice was heard from the entrance of the carriage, replying, "That's a lie, and you know it." All 4 tributes looked up to see their mentor, Asher Seatle, victor of the 78th Hunger Games, stood in the doorway in a fluffy red tulle dress. She bounced to the dining table, before telling each of the tributes to sit down in the chairs on the other side, and after a brief delay and further beckoning from Asher, they did as they were asked. Asher then looked at Rowan, who still had tears in his eyes, before telling him that he reminded her of her district partner, who was the first to die in her games, and that if he was pulling a Joanna, a reference to the victor of the 71st Hunger Games, he was going to tire himself out very quickly, and that he should save it for the training centre. This appeared to confuse all 4 tributes, and Hazel asked what a Joanna was, which caused Asher to shoot her a glance, before telling her not to worry. Asher proceeded to ask each of the 4 what their areas of expertise were, starting with Hazel, who said that she was good at sculpting wood, and that she often sculpted chairs from her neighbour's lumber, which caused Asher to let out an audible sound of indifference, before turning her attention to Balsa. She said that she was alright with an axe, and Asher squinted slightly before pointing at Hawthorne. He calmly stated that he worked in the outer forests within the crest, which made Asher's brow rise. She then asked him to go into more detail about what he could do with an axe, and he mentioned how he was able to chop through a range of trees, but when Asher asked if he had any practice with throwing axes, Hawthorne simply shook his head, to which he replied that they would work on that together. Asher then glanced towards Rowan, who was simply looking down in sorrow, but after realising that he did not know it was his turn, Asher suddenly slapped the table in front of Rowan several times, which made him jump and sit up in a panic, before stating that he could not use an axe, but that he was top of his class and could play the violin. Hawthorne grimaced, whilst Asher stared curiously at Rowan for several seconds. After a few more questions about their skills, Asher spoke to her tributes about the upcoming week. Balsa asked if she knew what the Quell conditions would involve exactly, but Asher shook her head and said that they would need to be on their toes, especially after what had occurred to her tributes in the last Quell. Yet this last sentence caused Hazel to become upset, and she asked if her brother had been killed because of Asher. This left Asher looking rather perplexed, until she appeared to realise that Hazel was talking about her brother, Otis Branks, who had been withdrawn from the 90th Hunger Games along with his district partner, Folia, after they had accidentally encountered each other in their apartment, which went directly against the conditions of this quell. Asher quickly replied that this had not been her fault at all, and that she was devastated by what happened, but that the offending party had been dealt with. She proceeded that this was what was meant by being on their toes, and that other mentors and tributes would use any opportunity they could in order to faze, scare, or even harm them. Hawthorne then said that his father had told him about Asher giving morphling to other tributes, and that she had removed the battery from another mentor's wheelchair, before asking if this was why the others would try to attack them. Asher looked at Hawthorne seriously, but when he mentioned the wheelchair, she was clearly trying to hold back laughter, although she said that it was not so important regarding why, but that they should simply be on their best behaviour. As it got dark, Asher began a bottle of red wine, which was giving her a rather shocking purple grin, and the dinner buffet was brought into the carriage. Whilst eating, Asher told the quartet a little more about the upcoming week, and even though Rowan was still clearly filled with sorrow, he appeared to pay attention to what he was hearing. Hawthorne and Hazel asked more questions, which Asher answered, but she gradually appeared to notice how quiet Balsa was being. Towards the end of the meal, Asher rather abruptly told the Avox present to grab an axe and a target, which was subsequently brought in. She then told Balsa to show what she could do with an axe, and although Balsa was initially quite hesitant regarding this request, she was ushered along by Asher to do as she was asked. Although Balsa's aim was not brilliant, and she appeared to be in a slight amount of pain after throwing the axes, Asher and the others seemed rather impressed by what Balsa was able to do, which prompted Asher to tell her to be more confident in her skills, before nodding at her in encouragement. As she continued through the bottle of wine, Asher asked for her games to be shown on screen, which captivated the four tributes in different ways. Yet when Rowan started crying again during the bloodbath, Asher simply rolled her eyes and told him to go to bed. She even spoke to him in the corridor outside the carriage, but it was not known what was said exactly. Once the games had finished, Hazel asked Asher if she had planned to win the games in this way, to which she simply replied that it had fallen into place, before winking and asking Hazel and Balsa to go to their carriages, which they proceeded to do. Asher then sat down with Hawthorne by the window, and whilst they looked at the stars in the sky, she poured a glass of wine for him as well. She proceeded to tell Hawthorne that the other three, especially the little one, would likely look up to him for guidance and support over the next week, and that whilst it would be kind of him to help them, he needed to look after himself most of all. Hawthorne appeared to understand what Asher meant, and once they had finished the bottle of wine between them, they headed to Asher's carriage for the night. After holding for almost 2 hours on the outskirts of the capital, the train finally made its entrance into Snow Station. Whilst making sure that her tributes looked as smart as possible, Asher reminded them that they needed to be exemplary to the crowd that would greet them, even if this seemed impossible. The train soon arrived, and Asher was the first to disembark, by jokingly jumping off the train and letting the tulle of her dress bounce around while skipping towards the crowd. Hawthorne then came down from the train and was almost immediately made to pose for photos with gaggles of young ladies, who were clearly enamoured by his good looks. He did not appear to have slept much, and even had some unidentified bite marks on his neck, but after this was noticed, the young fans appeared even more determined to pose for pictures with him. Meanwhile, Balsa came down from the train, and although she appeared happy to pose for pictures and sign her autograph, she was clearly quite uncomfortable with the amount of camera flashes, which caused most citizens to leave her alone, although once there were only a few left around her, she had a rather informative conversation with them about her life in District 7. Rowan's eyes were laden with tears as he stepped down from the train, and as he became thronged by capital crowds, he was clearly rather intimidated, which caused most of the crowd to step back and leave him alone before heading for the other tributes. As for Hazel, she naturally took to greeting the crowds and happily agreed to be in many pictures with them, even posing with children. She also enamoured the crowd by allowing one young girl, who had appeared fascinated by the bows in her hair, to have one of these bows. Hazel then acted in a rather flirtatious, yet humorous manner with several male citizens within the crowd, and Asher seemed generally content with her tributes. As the group had lunch in their apartment, they watched the reapings for the inner districts. Once they had finished, Asher made the phone call for her tribute stylists, who were revealed to be Victor Sickle for the boys and Ariadne Fling for the girls. Even Hawthorne seemed amazed by the sheer size of Victor, whose large muscles and deep voice were rather unusual for a stylist. After checking their measurements and eyeing the tributes carefully, Victor asked for lumberjack shirts from his team of stylists, and they rapidly produced the relevant sizes of brown and yellow fabric, along with matching trousers. As Victor spoke to his team some more, Rowan tried to make conversation with Hawthorne, who practically ignored him as he looked at the girls' fittings being taken instead. Once the outfits had been made, Hawthorne appeared slightly aghast when he looked in the mirror, but after seeing his expression, Victor grinned and told him that it was only for a few minutes. He then handed a fake axe to each of the boys, which appeared to appease Hawthorne, although Rowan almost dropped his when he first held it. As for the girls, Ariadne introduced herself by saying enchanté, which clearly surprised the girls, who were not familiar with this language. Hazel asked if this was Scottish, but Ariadne told her that it was something else and winked, before bringing over her team of stylists and taking measurements. After a brief assessment, Ariadne decided on dressing the pair as trees, embroidered with ivy and extravagant headdresses. Balsa appeared rather taken aback by this description, but as Ariadne went to speak to her stylists, Hazel jokingly told Balsa that it could be worse, before pointing at Hawthorne, who was looking at his outfit in the mirror with an expression that was difficult to describe. Balsa let out a slight laugh, and she and Hazel began to speak about their lives in District 7, which allowed them to bond over their mutual love of sculpture and other forms of art. As the girls spoke, they also looked at the screen, which was showing the talent demonstrations for the reigning District 1. Mirai Kobayashi wore a dazzling lilac suit, and she seemed very much in her element whilst hosting this section of the reaping process, greeting and introducing each volunteer before their demonstration was due to occur. The second of the 9 female volunteers to show her skills was 17-year-old Opal Rusinski, who came into the talent square wearing a sparkling scarlet leotard, which matched her combed-back ginger hair. When it was time to begin, she grabbed a bow and arrow before shooting arrows, at first from behind her back, then between her legs, all whilst hitting the targets given with high accuracy. For her final act, Opal leaned forwards onto her forearms before moving her feet over the top of her body to pick up the bow from the ground in front with her feet. She then used her toes to command the bow and fire arrows at the targets, once again with perfect accuracy. This surreal yet amusing display garnered a lot of applause, and Eugenia stated that she would surely make it through to the next round. The final female volunteer was 18-year-old Glamour Beckett, who wore a dazzling scarlet dress that Eugenia stated had to be one of the most expensive that she had seen in her 20 years of commentating. Glamour soon picked up a set of throwing knives, before throwing them in quick succession into a target in front of her. After almost a minute, she had thrown 15 knives into a heart shape, which caused a sympathetic sound from the audience, but it was swiftly interrupted as Glamour tossed her blonde plaits back over her shoulder, before roaring triumphantly and winking at Mayor Cardew. When it was time for the citizens' vote, both Opal and Glamour easily made it to the final 5. During the debates, Glamour eluded confidence and wasted no time in telling of her past achievements from the Academy, with even Ennius saying that she came across as arrogant. Yet one could not deny that Glamour was certainly well suited to fight for District 1, and she proceeded to score 51% of the first vote, thereby easily winning the title of the first female tribute. As for Opal, she took a more subtle approach within the debate, and remained relatively quiet until she was asked to respond, before giving concise yet informative answers. Both Ennius and Eugenia predicted that another volunteer was going to win the position of second female tribute, but they were surprised when Opal scored 36% of the next round of the vote, which saw her winning the title of the second female tribute. As for the boys, there was a record total of 16 volunteers who were fighting for the 2 spaces that were available this year, which led to there being only 3 minutes for each talent section. In the middle of the lineup was 18-year-old Dola Crouseau, who wore a 3-piece suit of scarlet colours. However, he began his demonstration by taking off his jacket to reveal a knife stuck to his back, which he threw straight at a nearby target. He then took off his shirt to reveal a small dagger taped to his side, which he threw at another target, before removing more items of clothing and using more hidden weapons that lay beneath each one. By the time Dola was down to his underwear, many younger citizens, mainly female, were in awe at his fine, muscular, olive-skinned frame, which along with his choppy black hair and startling green eyes, made him physically desirable to many indeed. Eugenia said that if he did not make it to the debate round, she would scream, but fortunately for her, This aesthetically pleasing display saw him sailing straight through when it was time for the vote. The penultimate talent demonstration was that of Quartz Malone, who wore the usual scarlet suit for District 1, but rather unusually for this district, he also had matted black dreadlocks that bobbed around slightly as he walked. He began his talent display by taking off his jacket in a humorously sensual manner, clearly mimicking Dola, which garnered laughter from the audience and even Dola himself. Quartz then amazed the audience by grabbing several of the heavier weights and boulders before throwing them to the other side of the talent square, which led Ennius to say that he had never seen a tribute throw a boulder of that weight this far, and Quartz swiftly made his way to the debate round. Compared to the female counterpart, the male debate round was rather chaotic, with two of the candidates arguing with each other and airing each other's private affairs, which caused Mirai to chastise them, before mentioning that they should show some decorum, although they both seemed to have already ruined each other's chances of being reaped. Dola remained calm and composed throughout the debate, but delivered strong, detailed responses to a variety of questions, whilst having an informative back and forth with Mirai, which saw him earn 33% of the first round of voting and win his place as the first male tribute. Quartz, on the other hand, was placed directly between the two arguing tributes, and he humoured viewers with his surprised facial expression, whilst continually looking back and forth between the two. Yet he also managed to be serious when it was necessary, and he showed good knowledge of past games when prompted, which saw him win 46% of the second round of voting and easily win the place as the second male tribute. All four tributes were then given some time to say their goodbyes to their loved ones. Opal's parents seemed slightly concerned, and her mother even asked if she was sure that she still wanted to go to the games, but Opal casually dismissed their concerns before telling them that she would be back soon. Glamour's father seemed extremely proud of her, whilst her mother reminded her to be polite and make the capital love her as much as everyone else did. It is also worth noting that as the peacekeeper present was trying to move Glamour's parents along, her mother slapped him, saying that she would leave when she was ready. However, when another peacekeeper arrived a minute later, she finally left. As for Dola, his family had recently filed for bankruptcy due to several forced closures of his father's diamond mines, but this was not widely known at the time. His parents seemed proud, yet sad to see him going to the games, but he assured them that he would do whatever he could to come back with the prize money that he would give to his parents, even though his father assured him that he simply wanted him to come back more than the money. Quartz's parents and older sister each said how proud they were of him for making it to the games and representing their district. He appeared humorous and said that he would soon come back, but when Quartz's nephew asked if he could play with his dreadlocks one last time, Quartz suddenly became somewhat forlorn. Although shortly before a tear seemed to be about to fall from his eye, his family were dismissed, and he and the others were soon escorted down to the train by Mirai. As it was already starting to get dark, no time was wasted, and the short journey to the capital began. Mirai quickly led the tributes to the main carriage of the train, where Estelle Van Roosh, victor of the 84th Games, was eagerly awaiting at the dining table. Due to this being Mirai's first year as a mentor, Estelle had given her the choice of which gender tribute she would like to mentor. Mirai allegedly spent some time deciding, before eventually choosing the girls, as she believed that, as a female, it would be easier to know how they would think and fight. Whilst the train traversed the rocky wastelands that lay between District 1 and the capital, Mirai briefed the tributes on the upcoming week and the events that lay ahead, starting with their imminent arrival at Snow Station, for which he advised them to not stop smiling. The tributes, although mainly Opal, proceeded to ask questions, the vast majority of which Mirai knew the answers to, with Estelle answering the few that she did not know. The dinner buffet was subsequently brought in, and Mirai told them to have something to eat before they arrived in the capital. As the tributes tucked into their food, Mirai asked Estelle how she was doing so far as a mentor, to which Estelle happily responded that she was doing fine and that she should not worry. As the tributes ate, Estelle then spoke to them about the Quell conditions, and how it seemed like teamwork could be extremely important this year. However, Glamour soon asked if they would still be able to win on their own, before saying that she did not wish to kill the others, but that it was something that would need to happen for her to win. An awkward silence ensued, and even Estelle seemed somewhat taken aback by Glamour's bluntness. Yet just as she was about to reply, Quartz said that if Glamour kept asking stupid questions, she would probably meet with an unfortunate accident before the games had even started. As Glamour's jaw dropped following Quartz's reply, Opal immediately appeared to stifle her laughter, but Dola quickly brought the conversation back to a relevant topic by asking Estelle and Mireille what the most challenging moments of their games were. Estelle replied that the final fight in her game was the most difficult, whilst Mireille became slightly sullen as she mentioned that it was most likely the moment when Lilac suddenly died in front of her, and that even losing Cayenne had been tough, but that this was a reminder that they should be prepared for anything that followed. Although it was night time when the train arrived in Snow Station, there was still a hub of activity, with many capital citizens desperate for a mere glimpse of District 1's tributes and their reigning victor. Each of the tributes handled these greetings well, with Glamour in particular enjoying posing for pictures, while several citizens asked to touch Quartz's dreadlocks, which he happily agreed to. The quartet handled these greetings so well, in fact, that Estelle and Mireille had to discreetly ask peacekeepers to prize their tributes away from the crowds, which eventually allowed them to get into the car that drove them through the streets that were being filled with pre-game parties and celebrations, until they finally arrived at the accommodation tower. As the tributes from District 1 had arrived in their apartment even later than they normally did, Estelle allowed the stylists to take the measurements that they needed, on condition that they made the costumes overnight, before delivering them back the next morning, so that they all had the day to prepare for the parade the next evening. Leonardo Anderson swiftly took the measurements for Glamour and Opal, before making some composite sketches. He showed these to Mireille, who seemed happy with what he had made, but when Glamour managed to look at these sketches, she interrupted, saying that she wanted to have less material over her back, and that she wanted to do her own makeup. Yet as Mireille began to tell Glamour not to interrupt, Opal lost her temper, before saying in a curt manner to Glamour that they were supposed to be working together, and that it was best to let their stylists and mentors do what they did best. Glamour looked like she was ready to reply, but Mireille marched towards her, saying that she did not want to hear another word from Glamour's mouth, which surprisingly had the desired effect. Quartz and Dola's stylist was Vipsania Platt, who had been designing for District 1 for the last 5 years. She took the measurements as well, but seemed very torn about what design she should go with. Vipsania had several hushed conversations with her team of stylists, whilst pointing at Quartz and Dola, who were made to stand still with their arms in the air. This made the boys laugh when they made eye contact with each other, and they began to discuss the talent demonstrations, before joking about the argument that had taken place during the debates. Quite a long time later, Vipsania marched back to the boys and told Estelle that she would be dressing them in dark blue suits encrusted with sapphire jewels. Estelle seemed pleased with this, and without another thought, she dismissed the stylists and told all 4 tributes to go to their bedrooms. The next evening, the parade went ahead as planned, with a record 26 chariots, each holding 2 tributes. Despite making a small fuss about the hem of her scarlet gown, Glamour was eventually silenced by Mireille, who proceeded to give a sympathetic nod to Opal, who smiled back. Estelle and Vipsania told both Dola and Quartz, the latter of whom had sapphire jewels in his hair, about how handsome they looked in their blue suits, and that they should simply be confident as they had good reason to be. However, shortly after they said this, Alicia Heath, victor of the 89th Hunger Games, who was stood with Nina and Dina Dalton from 2 on the carriage behind, shouted that they looked like pieces of bubble gum, and that her boys looked much more desirable. Although neither Dola nor Quartz appeared sure of what bubble gum was, Estelle discreetly stuck her middle finger up at Alicia, but then looked back to see Nero and Julius from 2, with their bulging muscles clearly on display in their scant outfits. As for Hazel and Belsa, they were initially quite daunted by their arboreal headdresses, but they now seemed to have become used to what they were wearing. Peacekeepers were deliberately stood between their carriage and that of the boys from 6 in front of them, with Madison Hawker, victor of the 85th Hunger Games, appearing to look for any opportunity to charge through and attack Asher. Meanwhile, Hawthorne and Rowan stood upon the carriage that lay behind Hazel and Balsa. Rowan looked around and seemed intimidated by the other tributes' outfits, but as Hawthorne noticed this, he was seen to grab Rowan by the scruff of his neck, before telling him that if he did not wave to the crowd and look happy, he would give him something to cry about once they were back at the apartment, and Rowan quickly agreed, while shaky in fear, but smiling in an almost exaggerated fashion. Opel and Glamour were the first out of the gate and waved warmly, with their scarlet latex outfits hugging every curve of their bodies. Some viewers were amused that Glamour was clearly trying to steal the limelight and wave her hand in front of Opal's face, but Opal managed to hold her own and ducked in front of Glamour's hand, which allowed her to be seen. Behind the ladies were Dola and Quartz, who held their hands up together in a show of fortitude. At the last minute, Dola had helped Quartz place some sapphire jewels into his dreadlocks, which now flowed behind him as his chariot raced down the parade, which not only looked interesting, but was well received by Anderson Fashion for showing commitment to their outfit theme. However, it was Dina and Nina who really stole the show in the front of the parade, in matching outfits made of gold feathers, which flew off into the wind behind them as they advanced down the avenue. Further down the line of chariots, Balsa and Hazel both seemed intimidated by the bright lights and quantity of viewers, but they continued to wave to the crowds and smile as much as they appeared capable of doing. On the chariot behind, Hawthorne actually appeared to be whispering to Rowan in an encouraging manner that he should wave to the crowds as well, and although Rowan initially seemed fazed, he did come out of his shell as the parade went on. When both these sets of tributes, their stylists and mentors, were watching the highlights of the parade in their apartments later that evening, Eugenia announced that Anderson Fashion would be naming one Best Dressed title for the male tributes and another for the female tributes, which caused excitement to many stylists as they now had a better chance of winning this coveted title. It was announced first that Jürgen Cardew's design for Dina and Nina had won this title for the female tributes, which triggered a cacophony of stamping to be heard on the ceiling above the apartment for District 1. Although Opal seemed relatively unaffected, Glamour was clearly quite annoyed. Meanwhile, in the District 7 apartment, Ariadne appeared upset to have not even received an honourable mention, and she headed to the balcony, where she was soon joined by Hazel and Balsa, although it is unknown what was discussed. Even though the trio were only on the balcony for roughly a minute, Ariadne seemed to have returned to her earlier contented mood when she and the tributes re-entered the apartment. As for the male tributes, it was the purple lame suits that were worn by Cotton and Synth from 8, and designed by Ava Berrick, victor at the 81st Hunger Games, which won this title for the male tributes, with several stylists even admitting that she had deserved this title once again. The next day, all 52 tributes were brought into the newly created and much larger training centre, where they were briefed by the head of training, Ennius Dalton. He firstly instructed the tributes that they had to stay at the same station as the other tribute in their reaping pair, which caused a scattering of disheartened groans. Ennius immediately took out his taser and turned it on, an action that was quickly emulated by his training staff, and the protesting sounds soon ceased. Yet just as Ennius was continuing to explain the rules of training, Walter, from 12, who was stood near to him, suddenly sneezed rather loudly, which prompted Ennius to poke him with the taser. Ennius proceeded to ignore Walter's cries of pain, before asking if anyone had any questions, and when nobody replied, the training began. Opel and Glamour spent the first day circulating between the weapons stations, where they realised that they were roughly equal in their weaponry skills when compared to each other. Dina and Nina asked them several times if they would practice fighting against them, and although Glamour was willing to accept this request, Opal politely declined, saying that they wanted to focus on themselves, which seemed to annoy Dina and Glamour. Yet they spent most of the second day fine-tuning their skills in the archery station, which appeared to impress and intimidate various other tributes. As for Quartz and Dola, they improved their individual fighting skills even further, with Quartz giving Dola many tips on how to improve his empty-handed combat, whilst Dola helped Quartz improve his aim in the spear station. They also accepted the request of Bryn and Douglas from 14 to practice sparring with them, and under the close eye of training staff, the 4 boys fought in a civilized manner with each other. On the second day, Dola noticed that they were being closely watched by Nero and Julius, but Quartz simply replied that they should ignore them, which they proceeded to do. Hazel and Balsa spent a lot of the first day in the survival station, where they worked with Eucalypta and Sundream from 11. The girls proceeded to share some helpful pieces of advice with each other about starting fires and creating shelters, and they also discussed the differences between their districts. On the second day, under Ash's request, they moved to the axe-throwing station, where Balsa improved her skills whilst also helping Hazel, who was able to at least throw an axe in the general direction of the target by the end of the day. As for Hawthorne and Rowan, a member of training staff had to follow them around the room for most of the first morning, in order to make sure that they stayed together. However, after Asher intervened, they spent most of the day in the axe station, where Hawthorne improved his skills and accuracy even further, whilst Rowan focused on being able to throw an axe in any direction, and his efforts eventually seemed to pay off. Yet on the second day, Hawthorne asked Sickle and Rory from 9 if he could watch them using their scythes, which they agreed to in exchange for watching him throw some more axes again. Rowan did not seem particularly interested in this, but during the afternoon he asked to see what Infra and Batrina from 3 were doing in the electric station, which Hawthorne eventually agreed to. The girls allowed the boys to watch, but Batrina seemed to notice that their mentor, Gif Schneider, victor of the 91st Hunger Games, was mouthing something to them from the mentoring gallery above, which resulted in Batrina pushing a live wire towards Hawthorne, and thereby causing him to yelp in pain. She immediately stated that this was an accident, but Hawthorne quickly insisted to Rowan that they leave the station. The next day was the assessment and training scores, and this year it was kept extremely private as to what tributes decided to display. However, it was openly stated that the pairs of tributes would be assessed together, with their scores being formed by observing both of their ranges of skills. This year's top scorers were Nero and Julius, who managed a combined score of 11, although they were closely followed by Quartz and Dola, along with Dina and Nina, with a score of 10. Glamour and Opal also tied with Cropper and Jan from 9, and Holstein and Matteo from 10, for a respectable score of 9. Mirai and Estelle both seemed pleased with their tribute scores, with Estelle reminding them all that being the top scorer could actually be more of a curse than a blessing, as Nero and Julius could now be targeted by other tributes. Further down the lineup were Hazel and Balsa, who scored a 7, whilst Hawthorne and Rowan scored a 5. When these scores were announced, Asha seemed to be paying more attention to the mirror in front of her than to the screen, but when Hazel asked if she thought these were good scores, Asha simply replied that they were wonderful, whilst continuing to examine her eyebrows in the mirror. At the very bottom of this year's scores were Gila and Walter, from 12, who only scored a 3, and coincidentally had the youngest average age between them. The next evening were the interviews, and like the other Quells, both Eugenia and Ennius interviewed the tributes. Furthermore, each pair was interviewed as one, which soon became an accurate indicator as to whether they could work well together, whilst also comedically leading to them having to sit on the palm chair together. Glamour and Opal began the evening in scarlet dresses that were embroidered with a plethora of ruby jewels. There was initially some friction between the pair, with Glamour answering many of the questions in place of Opal and boasting of her accomplishments. Yet when Ennius made a point of asking a question directly to Opal, she said that she believed they could use their different personalities and strengths together, which produced some awkward laughter between the two girls, but applause from the audience nonetheless. The next tributes to be interviewed were Dola and Quartz, who wore matching burgundy suits. As they joked about their experiences together before and after the training, Eugenia said that it appeared like they had known each other for a long time, but Dola said that although this was not the case, they had quickly become good friends. However, as the audience made a sympathetic sound of appreciation, Ennius said that it was a shame that their friendship was about to end, which caused Eugenia to jokingly hit his arm. The interview of Velos and Candelo from 5 was rather amusing for capital audiences, with the boys arguing about whose fault it was that they had not received a higher training score, and a peacekeeper soon had to stand between them in case their argument turned violent. During this time, their mentor, Lynette Laurier, victor of the 82nd Hunger Games, was seen to be cringing from the audience, and whilst Ennius was clearly trying not to laugh, Eugenia desperately tried to get a word in, but to no avail, which caused more laughter within the audience. Hazel and Balsa's interview was relatively routine, and although they were commended for their finely designed ebony-coated dresses, along with their civil manner with each other, it was later stated that their interview was rather forgettable, and that nothing of worthy value was discussed that would change capital citizens' opinions of these girls. The next interview was that of Hawthorne and Rowan. Not long into the interview, Ennius said that they looked like a lost child who had just been abducted by someone who was not his father, which Hawthorne tried to laugh about. Yet the pair seemed more uncomfortable after being asked by Ennius if they hoped to be working with or against each other in the arena, with Rowan replying with, whilst Hawthorne replied against. As controversial laughter was heard from the audience, Ennius said that they would end the interview there, before dismissing the pair. After a rather surreal set of interviews with the District 14 tributes, which involved Ennius asking them to repeat what they had to say on several occasions, especially in the case of Aoife and Iona's interview, it was time for game maker Artulia Fling's interview. Ennius and Eugenia each put in a lot of effort to convince Artulia to reveal the nature of these games, but she managed to keep the relevant facts to herself. However, she did reveal that this was in fact going to be her last year as the game maker, as she wanted to focus on her family and the arrival of her and her wife's upcoming triplets. Although this caused an outcry from the audience, Ennius and Eugenia each seemed very understanding, and applause was soon triggered, with Eugenia even wiping away a tear at this news. Yet Artulia stated that she planned to go out in style, which caused more rapturous cheers from the audience. She proceeded to mention that this was going to be a difficult year indeed for the tributes, and like nothing that had been seen before, to which Eugenia replied that she could not wait to see how this turns out, and Artulia responded that neither could she. The next day, each pair of tributes was given a brief goodbye period with their mentor, before being taken by hovercraft from the roof of the accommodation tower to the arena, that lay just a few kilometres outside the capital. Once the tributes arrived in their holding rooms, they were each ordered to dress in the black jacket, trousers and boots that were provided. Yet just as most pairs were discussing if they both needed to enter their tube at the same time, 2 peacekeepers entered each holding room, with 1 light metal chain and 2 light metal belts. It was seen on the cameras that it was at this moment when most tributes realised how the conditions of the quell would be enacted. Some tributes complained, but most were clearly in shock. Hawthorne and Rowan appeared to be scratching themselves a lot that morning, with Rowan's moaning irritating Hawthorne in particular. Hawthorne then refused to put on the belt and chain, which caused him to be threatened by one of the peacekeepers, before begrudgingly placing it around his waist. Glamour was also not happy about having to be linked to Opal, but Opal soon managed to calm her down, before saying that they needed to work together, and that for what it was worth, the things she said in the interview were true. Remarkably, this talk appeared to work, and Glamour soon calmed down, before putting on the belt. The belts were promptly adjusted by each set of peacekeepers to be tight enough to stay around the tributes' waists, but not tight enough to cause them pain. The chains were then attached to the tributes' belts, and as tributes felt them in their hands and practiced walking around, the chains were seen to be approximately 1 metre long, and with a small flashing device in the very middle. Dola and Quartz were surprised by how light their chain was, and as they quickly practiced walking around their holding room together, they were pleased to notice that their belts would swiftly rotate around their waists, in accordance with the position of the chain that attached them to each other. The tributes were then ordered to enter their tubes together, which despite being an enclosed space for 2 tributes, was still managed by all of them. Hazel was also spotted scratching herself that morning, and although Balsa was clearly feeling a burning sensation on her skin as well, she told Hazel to stop, as this was bad for her skin. Yet as the girls entered their tube, Hazel appeared to become scared about the enclosed space that they had suddenly been forced into. Balsa tried to calm Hazel down by reminding her to breathe slowly, and after a few seconds this seemed to work, just as the tubes started to rise up into the arena. This year's games took place in an arena known as the Valley of Death. This year's arena was built around a wide valley of just over 3 kilometers in length. This valley ran from the north to the south of the arena, albeit with a curve inclined to its east. Both sides of the valley were steep, uneven, and laden with jagged rocks. Beyond the sides of the valley were various hills that rose and fell until they reached the perimeter of the arena, with large rocks, sudden declines, and hidden alcoves scattered throughout. However, in the northwest section, one would suddenly experience a steep drop in the terrain before reaching a narrow flowing river that lay close to the perimeter, whilst a thick forest made up a large area of the arena's southeast section. Lounges of lizards, parliaments of owls, and flocks of sheep also roamed throughout the arena, with no particular pattern or motive to their movement, unless they were programmed otherwise by Game Maker Fling. The cornucopia lay halfway along the length of the valley, just to the east of the arena's centre, in the middle of an enormous field that was bordered on all sides by lines of trees. Large podiums lay in a complete circle around the edge of this field, and it was quickly noticed by Ennius that as the tributes reached the top of the tubes, they had slightly more space on their podiums than they appeared to have had in their tubes, which enabled the tributes to move carefully once they had risen into the arena. Inside the circle of podiums was well over twice the usual amount of bread, cheese, fruit, water, sleeping bags, blankets, tarpaulins and ropes, along with some weapons such as bows, arrows and scythes that lay scattered near the cornucopia. This large marble structure only contained 4 thin columns at each corner, which allowed tributes to see through to the other side. Beneath its flat roof were large quantities of any weapon imaginable, although the most valuable weapons, such as spears, daggers and tridents, lay in the very centre. As tributes' podiums rose to the ground, The vast majority looked at their surroundings, with many holding on to their partners, in order to ensure that they did not fall to the ground. After almost 30 seconds, Game Maker Fling welcomed the tributes to the 95th Hunger Games, before wishing that the odds be in their favour. Yet just as she was ending this sentence, a yelp was heard from the southwestern side of the circle, as one of the girls from District 6 misjudged her footing and tripped off the podium, pulling her screaming partner to the ground as she fell. A loud explosion was heard as the girls hit the ground, and 2 cannons sounded, almost in unison. Ennius then laughed, and said that he knew this was going to happen to someone, although Eugenia stated that the explosion was not as big as she thought it would be. Neither did it overly affect Nero and Julius from 2, or Cotton and Synth from 8, who stood on the podiums either side and were only hit by a small smattering of soil. Many tributes then stood completely still, most likely in order to avoid the same fate, and the countdown soon began from 60 seconds. A lot of the pairs of tributes began to look towards the cornucopia and quietly whispered to each other about what they should aim to take, or if they should even aim to enter the inner circle at all. As the camera showed this myriad of frantic, yet private conversations amidst the countdown, Eugenia laughed and said that this really was like nothing that they had ever seen before. Hazel and Balsa, from 7, were placed just a few podiums clockwise to where the girls from 6 had fallen, and they proceeded to hold each other close on their podium, whilst whispering about where they should head. They were heard to agree on taking some food and drink, but when Hazel suggested grabbing a sleeping bag, Balsa quietly shook her head and whispered that they should not be greedy. Quartz and Dola, from 1, were positioned on the southern side of the clearing, and as the countdown continued, they quietly agreed to run straight for the nearest bow and arrow that they could see, which lay close to, but not inside, the cornucopia. Quartz said that they should run away after this, and that he would grab some food and drink, whilst Dola covered him with the bow and arrow. The boys then looked around at the nearest tributes, whilst quietly discussing what they thought their plans were. On the northeastern side of the circle were Hawthorne and Rowan from 7. Hawthorne quickly said that they would be going to the cornucopia, and that Rowan would need to keep up. For the rest of the countdown, Hawthorne looked with a determined expression towards the weapons that lay inside, whilst Rowan turned an extremely bright shade of pale. As for Opel and Glamour from 1, they were stood on the most northern podium, and quietly discussed grabbing a set of throwing knives that they could see lying directly in front of them within the mouth of the cornucopia. All tributes seemed to become very tense as the final 10 seconds of the countdown occurred, but fortunately no more tributes hit the ground until the gong finally sounded. Hazel and Balsa immediately ran inwards, and fortunately for them, they kept roughly the same running speed, which allowed them to run in unison and not fall over, unlike several other pairs, including Douglas and Bryn from 14, who were positioned next to them and fell to the ground just seconds after the gong had sounded. The girls stuck to their plan, and Hazel managed to grab a loaf of bread, whilst Balsa grabbed 2 bottles of water. As they saw Perch and Skate from 4 each being strangled by Dina and Nina from 2 just in front of them, Balsa shouted that they needed to get out, but Hazel seemed tempted by a large green tarpaulin that lay just feet from her reach. She shouted that she could grab it, and although Balsa appeared to be against this idea, she allowed herself to be pulled forwards by the chain, which allowed Hazel to grab the tarpaulin, before running back towards Balsa, who insisted at that point that they fled. They proceeded to sprint west, and within a minute were running across an adjacent field, with only Holstein and Matteo from 10 in sight, although they were running to the north, and did not appear interested in attacking Hazel and Balsa. Meanwhile, Dola and Quartz had also stuck to their original plan, and ran directly to the north, with Dola grabbing a bow and arrow that lay near to the cornucopia, just seconds after the gong had sounded. He twirled around for targets, and Quartz quickly alerted him to the boys from 3, who were now running towards them with a scythe that they had picked up. Dola shot one of the boys in the heart, which caused him and then his partner to fall to the ground, with the latter now screaming on his knees and desperately trying to break the connecting chain. As they then spotted Nero and Julius running into the cornucopia, Dola saw the boys from 6 that had fallen in a disorganized heap on the ground to their right. Dola immediately shot one of these boys in the head, but just as he looked ready to shoot the other, Quartz alerted him to Dina and Nina, who were stood to their west and now looked ready to head for Eucalypta and Sondrine from 11, who were running between them. Dola held back, and Quartz shouted that he wanted a spear from the cornucopia, which Dola quickly agreed to. They sprinted towards the structure, where they saw Nero throwing a trident towards the northeast area of the clearing. Before Julius could throw his own trident, Quartz snatched a spear from the ground nearby, and Dola shouted that they needed to go, whilst pointing at Nero and Julius. Dola and Quartz then sprinted in a southeast direction, before snatching up a sleeping bag, some cheese, fruit, and 2 bottles of water. After continuing past the circle of podiums, Dola suggested attacking the girls from 12 to their right, who were desperately trying to get to their feet at the same time, but Quartz said that someone else would do it, and they proceeded through the tree line. On the other side of the clearing, Hawthorne and Rowan had run inwards, as the former had ordered. Although Rowan predictably ran slower than Hawthorne, he just about managed to keep up, but Jen and Cropper from 9, who had been on a podium next to them, appeared to spot them nearing each other as they approached the cornucopia. The boys ran just ahead, and Jen tripped Rowan with her foot, which caused not only him, but also Hawthorne to collapse to the ground. As the girls continued to the cornucopia, Hawthorne desperately tried to get to his feet, while screaming at Rowan, who was not only in pain on the floor, but also scratching intensely, apparently making no effort to get up. Hawthorne's shouting became louder, and he proceeded to grab Rowan by the scruff of his neck. He practically threw Rowan over his shoulder, before running as quickly as he could towards the cornucopia. Yet seconds later, Hawthorne spotted Nero and Julius standing within the centre of the cornucopia and aiming a trident at Opel and Glamour from 1, who stood between them. The girls narrowly avoided the trident, and it flew past them, hitting Rowan in the back. This resulted in a shrill scream, and Hawthorne looked around in a panic, but just as it seemed like he was about to pull the trident from Rowan's back, Rory and Sickle from 9 ran up behind Hawthorne, and the former stabbed him in the neck, which caused both him and Rowan to fall to the ground once more. As for Glamour and Opal, they had run straight to the cornucopia when the gong sounded. Once they entered the structure, they grabbed a pair of throwing knives and started throwing them, with Glamour hitting one of the girls from 5 as they tried to pick up some food and water nearby. Opal then nearly hit Nero in the head with the knife, but he swiftly ducked, before alerting Julius, who picked up a trident and looked ready to aim for them. Julius took a small run-up before throwing his trident directly at Glamour, who was looking away for more weapons. Yet with a fraction of a second to spare, Opal tackled Glamour to the ground, with a later replay showing that the trident would have hit her in the face if she had not been moved. As they looked around to see this trident hitting Rowan in the back, Opal said that they needed to run, but whilst Nero and Julius each grabbed another trident, Opal and Glamour stumbled along the ground in front of them, behind several large crates of weapons, one of which was hit by Nero's trident, until they reached another set of throwing knives. Opal snatched it, before saying to Glamour that they now needed to run, just as the blood of various other tributes began to hit them from behind. Although Glamour's ankle was hit by a prong of Julius's trident, it simply bounced off her boot and caused no further injury. They quickly lapped up a sleeping bag, some cheese, bread and water, before sprinting onwards through the field ahead, occasionally looking around for any pursuers, although fortunately for Glamour and Opal, they were not being chased. Yet shortly after they ran through the tree line at the edge of the field, Glamour noticed that the girls from 10 were hiding behind a tree that lay only a few meters to the right of where they had crossed the tree line. Eugenia theorized that they were possibly waiting to take something once there were less tributes in the field, and Ennius replied that they were possibly pretty stupid. The girls from 10 gasped after seeing Glamour and Opal, before getting up and trying to run away, whilst Glamour grinned and said that she wanted to kill both these tributes. Before Opal could even reply, Glamour threw a knife and hit one of the girls in her head. Opal suggested that they kill one each, but Glamour ignored her request and threw her other knife, hitting the other girl in the neck. Although Opal seemed a little annoyed that she had not been able to practice her knife-throwing skills, she did not appear to think it worth the trouble of complaining to Glamour, and the girls simply carried on running north through the valley. Hazel and Balsa continued to the west, travelling up the side of a hill as quickly as they could, whilst Hazel complained about her itching sensation, and Balsa assured her that they could find something to stop her itching once they reached a safe hiding place. As the girls reached the top of this hill, they looked back down to the cornucopia to see both pairs from District 2 placing the remaining supplies underneath the structure, whilst other pairs fled in a variety of directions, but fortunately for Hazel and Balsa, they were not being approached by others. After almost an hour of walking, they heard 16 cannons that were divided into 8 sets of 2 beats that almost sounded in unison, which represented 8 pairs. At this point, Hazel insisted that they rested in a rocky decline in the hill, from which they could see ahead, and Balsa appeared happy to agree to this. As they settled, Hazel apologized for risking grabbing the tarpaulin and for complaining about itching, but Balsa quickly forgave her, although she said that she needed to try not to itch her skin, and that they should now make as many decisions as they could together, which Hazel agreed to. Approximately 10 minutes later, another pair of cannons, later dubbed double cannon, sounded, which was shown to viewers to belong to Jen and Cropper from 9, who had collapsed down the side of a hill together and broken 27 bones between them. Although Jen was able to move, she was anchored down by Cropper, who proceeded to shout in pain, which led to them being soon discovered and killed by Velos and Candela from 5. Hazel and Balsa watched the flocks of sheep and examined the hills that flowed off to the perimeter. They both seemed pleased that their itching was gradually subsiding, even though Hazel's arms were now rather red. After a closer visual analysis of Hazel's skin, Eugenia relayed the information that the itching had likely been caused by a powder that was often placed on bedsheets, which appeared to have affected all 4 tributes from District 7, with Ennius asking why someone would bother to sabotage such a weak district. Yet just as Eugenia and Ennius finished discussing this topic, Balsa suddenly pulled Hazel into the decline in the ground where they had been hiding, before saying that she had seen a pair walking in the distance. This was indeed correct, and it was shown to be Sickle and Rory from 9, who were making their way to the perimeter. The girls rested quietly, but fortunately for them, they remained unseen. However, just as they rested still, Balsa let out a quiet yelp when she spotted a light green lizard crawling towards her along her and Hazel's chain. As they saw more of the lizard's lounge approaching, Hazel whispered to Balsa to stay still and that they were harmless, even though it seemed like she was unsure of this fact. Although the lizards continued to crawl across both of their bodies, they soon made their way east, with Balsa breathing out a sigh of relief as they left. She thanked Hazel, who let out a small laugh, and said that Balsa's facial expression had at least been funny. After a brief exploration, the girls discovered a lizard's nest nearby, but agreed to return and rest within the decline of the ground where they had been hiding. Meanwhile, Dola and Quartz had headed southeast from the cornucopia, and they heard 16 cannons from the bloodbath sounding as they reached the top of the first hill. They proceeded across the hills and heard the distant screams of Jen and Cropper, followed by a double cannon as they made their way towards the large forest that lay on this side of the arena. After almost 2 hours, Dola and Quartz finally reached this forest, and did not witness any other tributes on their way, even though Infra and Batrina from 3 had in fact spotted them towards the end of this journey, but the girls narrowly avoided them by hiding within a rocky alcove. The boys proceeded to rest within a sparse section of this forest, and they shared a rather awkward yet amusing moment when Dola needed to relieve himself, and Quartz joked that this was the most distressing thing he had witnessed so far in the arena. Yet just as Dola was pulling his trousers up, he and Quartz suddenly heard a branch cracking to their right, and Quartz quickly pulled Dola behind a tree, where they readied their weapons. They waited for a few seconds in silence, until an arrow hit Quartz's shoulder. Even though it only mildly pierced his skin, Quartz shouted, and Dola immediately pinned him against the tree on the other side of the arrow's origin, whilst holding his spear at the ready. A few seconds later, Perch from 4 leaned out from behind a tree and pulled back another arrow, but before he could let it fly, Dola quickly launched his spear through the air, which hit Perch in the chest, and he fell to the ground, bringing his partner, Skate, with him. Dola and Quartz then sprinted towards where the boys from District 4 had fallen, just as Skate was trying to grab the bow and arrow that Perch had dropped. However, Dola continued running, and Quartz soon matched his pace, until they reached their opponents. Dola then trod on Skate's hand, just as he was about to grab the arrow, whilst Quartz pulled the spear from Perch's chest before plunging it through Skate's neck. Their double cannon sounded, and Quartz thanked Dola, who replied that he was welcome. They took the boys' supplies, and as the hovercraft came to collect the bodies, they made their way deeper into the forest, where Dola checked Quartz's wound, but they were both pleased to see that it would likely heal soon. The pair rested over the afternoon, and bonded over their experiences at the academy, as well as their opinions on the attractiveness of their female opponents. Meanwhile, Opel and Glamour had continued to the north through the valley, until they heard the 16 cannons. Glamour said that she needed to rest, and Opel, who also seemed tired, was happy to oblige to this suggestion, and they rested in a small forest that lay just ahead, next to a lake that formed the start of the river. As they rested, Opel looked around and said that they should stay in this forest. Glamour agreed, but before Opal could stop her, she guzzled down one of their 3 bottles of water. Opal looked shocked, but Glamour said that she could fill it up again in the nearby lake. Opal quickly replied that the lake's water could be poisonous, and that they should make do with what they already had. Glamour grabbed her water bottle before asking Opal to stand up, so they could walk to the lake that lay just a few meters away. However, Opal refused, and said that it was not worth the risk. This enraged Glamour, who tugged on the end of the chain and desperately tried to move Opal, but to no avail. Eugenia even commented that many tributes looked like they were pulling stubborn dogs when they tried to move their partners. The double cannon of Jen and Cropper sounded, which caused Glamour to jump, but Opal said that once they finished the water they already had in their bottles, they could maybe then take some from the river, to which Glamour rolled her eyes but agreed. Opal then said that Glamour should try to be more grateful, and that she had already saved her life back at the cornucopia, so Glamour could at least listen to what she had to say, and maybe even thank her. Glamour looked Opal up and down in a judgmental manner, but then seemed to soften her expression before saying thank you, to which Opal smiled and said that she was welcome. After a few silent moments, Opal asked Glamour about who she was friends with in District 1, but within a few minutes, Opal appeared as bewildered as most Capital viewers to hear the intricate details of Glamour's personal life, including her recent exploits with her boyfriend, Chrysler, and the intimate details of her parents' wild parties. Yet just as she was beginning to mention the most interesting details of the latter topic, the double cannon of Perch and Skate from 4 was heard, which prompted Glamour to be quiet. However, after realizing they were safe, Glamour stated that she was feeling tired and that she would like her afternoon nap. Opal begrudgingly said that she would watch over her, and she even seemed surprised when Glamour thanked her, and she lowered her head to the ground. As the sun began to set, it was noticed by the surviving tributes that the temperatures were rather surprisingly beginning to rise throughout the arena, which was causing many tributes to remove their jackets, and for some of the boys to even remove their t-shirts as well. Hazel and Belsa each took off their jackets, before drinking their water and eating some bread. For the next hour, they spoke a little about life in District 7, and Hazel tearfully recounted the day that her elder brother, Otis, had been reaped for the games, and how she and her family had not been able to say their goodbyes due to the quell conditions of that year. Yet just as she asked Belsa some more about her past, the ground suddenly began to shake beneath them. It was shown to viewers that an earthquake had been triggered throughout the arena, which was causing most tributes to cower and grip onto each other or whatever solid objects lay near. Hazel began to cry with fear, but Belsa managed to hold on to her, and after a minute had passed, the ground was once again as still as it had been before. Hazel still seemed scared of what had happened, and Belsa asked if she was hurt, but after a quick check, she responded that she was unharmed. Belsa comforted her, and said that they should be pleased to have survived the first day, to which Hazel replied that it was not yet over. Belsa humorously rolled her eyes, but Hazel thanked her for having helped her so far. Just then, a double cannon sounded, which was shown to viewers to belong to Delta and Coral from 4, after they had collapsed down the side of the steep hill by the Northwest River. Although Delta had been knocked unconscious, Coral used all her strength to pull her to the safety of the riverbank, but as they rested, they were approached by Dina and Nina from 2, who swiftly killed them. Shortly after hearing these cannons, Balsa agreed to take the first watch, and Hazel slept, although she was awoken an hour later when the double cannon of Holstein and Mateo from 10 sounded, after Mateo had accidentally walked into the northeastern perimeter, which caused both him and Holstein to receive a fatal electric shock. After almost another hour had passed, Horn of Plenty played, and the portraits of both boys from 3, Perch, Skate, Delta and Coral all from 4, both girls from 5, all tributes from 6, Hawthorne and Rowan from 7, both girls from 8, Cropper and Jen from 9, Holstein, Mateo and both girls from 10, both boys from 11, and both girls from 12 were all shown, which meant that 26 tributes had fallen and 26 remained. As Hawthorne and Rowan were shown, Balsa said that this was a shame, but Hazel said that there was no way they would successfully fight together before falling back to sleep. Meanwhile, Dola and Quartz had been resting in the southeastern forest, where they relaxed, ate, and kept watch. Yet as the heat rose throughout the arena, the temperatures rose even further in the forest, with Dola becoming the first tribute to take his jacket and shirt off, and Quartz jokingly calling him Panatena, and asking if he wanted wine or whiskey, which made Dola insult him in a humorous manner, but one that still had to be censored when shown in later broadcasts. However, just as Quartz felt the effects of the heat and decided to take off his own jacket, the ground suddenly began to shake, and the boys both crouched down beneath the trees, whilst getting ready to run. Although a single tree fell just a few meters away from them, neither Quartz nor Dola was hurt, but Quartz suggested that they head to the edge of the forest in case this happened again, and they needed to flee from the forest. As the double cannon of Delta and Coral sounded, Dola agreed, and they picked up their supplies before heading slowly yet carefully in a northwestern direction until they reached the edge of the forest. While settling down and eating some of their food, Quartz pointed out that this was a good position to keep watch for approaching tributes, and Dola said that they should stay there for the next day in order to keep a lookout, which Quartz enthusiastically agreed to. As the double cannon of Holstein and Matteo sounded, he also agreed to keep the first watch, and Dola lay down to sleep. Meanwhile, Glamour and Opal were still resting by the lake in the northern forest. As the sun set but the heat levels rose, both girls took off their jackets, but Glamour soon decided to take off her t-shirt as well, before accidentally dropping some of the water from a bottle onto her cleavage, which clearly annoyed Opal. As Glamour tried to insist that this was an accident, the ground began to shake, which saw Opal try to get to her feet, whilst Glamour appeared to point her chest towards the nearest camera. However, they soon proceeded to sit back down on the ground until the tremors stopped. Glamour was about to get up and grab some more water, as she claimed that the earthquake had left her feeling dehydrated, but before she had got to her feet, the double cannon of Coral and Delta sounded. Glamour quickly cowered back down and asked Opal who she thought this cannon belonged to, but just as Opal appeared to be thinking, she was suddenly distracted by a lizard that had crawled onto her hand, which made her jump in shock and then fall as she tripped over a nearby branch, which caused Glamour to fall with her. Glamour became particularly annoyed and told Opal to calm down. Even though Opal insisted that she was not scared, Glamour grabbed another lizard and said that they were harmless. She then smiled and bit the head off this lizard, which she spat out, before eating the rest of its body, which left Capital viewers and even Opal looking rather shocked. The pair proceeded to consume some of their bread and water, although Opal soon appeared to stop paying attention to Glamour. Eventually, as the double cannon of Holstein and Matteo sounded, Opal asked Glamour if she could take the first watch, as she had watched over her that afternoon, which Glamour initially refused to do. Yet after some more bargaining, Glamour eventually agreed, which allowed Opal to fall asleep shortly after the portraits of the fallen were shown. Around 7 hours later, the sun began to rise, and Hazel awoke Balsa, before offering her some of their water and bread. For most of the morning, they remained in the same place, beneath the tarpaulin that camouflaged well against the grass. They briefly discussed taking some more of the supplies that lay beneath the cornucopia, but after they heard the double cannon of Candelo and Velos from 5, they decided to stay where they were until they had run out completely. As for Dola and Quartz, they slept until the mid-morning, at which point they headed to the edge of the forest, where for the rest of the morning they only spotted Cotton and Synth from 8 in the distance. This pair were trying to use a scythe in order to catch and shear a flock of sheep, much to the amusement of Eugenia, Ennius, and Capital viewers. Dola and Quartz each decided that it was not worth approaching them, but when Quartz stated that Cotton and Synth should have tried to use some form of trap for the sheep, Dola quickly responded that this gave him an idea. He said to Quartz that they could set spring traps along the entrance to the forest, as other tributes would likely head towards this area soon, possibly for a hiding place from the tributes from District 2. They could then capture and kill these tributes, before taking their supplies and remaining in this forest for as long as possible. Quartz was quickly convinced, although he openly admitted that he was not gifted at setting these traps, and so Dola gave him some advice on how to set them, by sharpening a stick and holding it in place with a group of other sticks, which would allow it to spring forth into the person who had encountered this trap. Just after Dola had shown Quartz the first trap, they heard the double cannon of Candelo and Velos, and so they quickly started building more of these traps. The pair spent most of the morning creating 17 of these traps between them on the paths that lay along the kilometre stretch of the forest's opening, which Dola said would likely catch something or someone. Meanwhile, in the northern end of the valley, Opal had awoken that morning to the sounds of Glamour drinking from the nearby lake, which made Opal angrily shout that she was being selfish, as this would lead to them both being eliminated if she was poisoned by the water. An argument soon ensued between the girls, but they were both distracted when the double cannon sounded, and they saw the bodies of Candelo and Velos being retrieved from the cornucopia field. Glamour correctly guessed that these deaths were caused by the tributes from District 2. It was seen that this group had enticed other tributes to enter the cornucopia field by leaving all the supplies beneath the cornucopia and hiding within the tree line at the edges, before cornering and killing the tributes once they had entered the field. Glamour said that they should head towards the cornucopia in order to try and target the tributes from District 2. After an intense discussion, Opal eventually agreed for them to head south through the valley and wait nearer the cornucopia. As they began to walk, Glamour spoke about what she planned on doing to the tributes from District 2, but when Opal reminded her not to get ahead of herself, Glamour told her not to be so cowardly, which made Eugenia comment that this was one of her favourite pairings due to the way that they were annoying each other so easily. When the sun had reached its highest point in the sky, the arena had naturally become quite warm, although not as warm as it had been the previous evening. However, after almost 2 hours, a light rain began to fall, at first not too heavily, but after 10 minutes, deep puddles and thick, moist clouds were forming upon the upper hills, along the sides of the valley. Furthermore, the sounds of thunder and lightning soon made inter-pair communication almost impossible for all tributes. Most tributes who had been hiding at the top of these hills decided to descend into the valley due to the poor visibility and adverse weather upon these hills. Whilst most tributes successfully climbed down the hills and hid within the undergrowth at the bottom of the valley, where the weather conditions were slightly more tolerable, Eucalypta and Sandrine from 11 slipped and fell on the eastern hill, which led to Eucalypta breaking her neck and Sandrine smacking her head against a rock, with their double cannons sounding when they finally came to a standstill at the bottom of the valley. Meanwhile, Hazel and Balsa had begun to shelter beneath their tarpaulin in their previous resting spot, but when the rainfall intensified and the visibility decreased, they discussed returning to the valley. However, Hazel soon pointed out that they would be exposing their position to other tributes, and that it would be best to stay where they were, even if the weather was inhospitable. Although Balsa's teeth were chattering and icicles appeared to be forming in her afro, she eventually agreed. As the double cannon of Eucalypta and Sandrine was heard, Balsa said that this had probably been a good idea of Hazel not only to stay in this position, but also to have taken the tarpaulin in the first place. Hazel said that she was glad to have been placed with Balsa, instead of someone like Rowan or Hawthorne, and they appeared to distract themselves from the cold by discussing people they knew in District 7 as the rainfall continued. Almost an hour later, another double cannon sounded, but they remained beneath the tarpaulin, occasionally looking out from beneath but seeing nobody nearby. Meanwhile, Dola and Quartz had remained at the edge of the forest, whilst being careful to avoid the traps that they had just finished setting. Due to the density of the forest, they were not so affected by the rainfall, and as they heard the double cannon of Eucalypta and Sandrine, they speculated about who it could belong to. Yet just as Dola was joking that someone had probably wanted to kill Glamour after hearing her speak, Quartz quickly silenced him when he spotted a pair of tributes running towards the forest. The boys both crouched behind trees with their spears at the ready, as they spotted Aoife and Iona from 14, desperately running through the rain towards an area of the forest that lay only 100 meters to their right. Quartz whispered to Dola that they would see if the trap works, and surely enough, after almost 2 minutes had passed, a loud scream was heard from this location after Iona had been hit through the stomach with the stick from this trap. Quartz and Dola sprinted towards this sound as the screams of both girls continued, and after a few minutes they had been spotted by Aoife, who begged for mercy as Iona slumped forwards on the stick. Ennius asked what they were waiting for, but Dola asked Aoife if she knew where the tributes from District 2 were. Aoife shouted that she did not know, but Quartz added that he and Dola would help her and Iona out of this trap if she told him. Aoife carefully eyed Dola's spear, before telling him that the tributes from District 2 were in the cornucopia clearing, where they had stockpiled all the supplies that were left over. Dola thanked her and smiled, but as Aoife asked to be helped off, Dola scratched his nose, and Quartz slammed his spear into the back of her head. As Dola and Quartz proceeded to take the girls' water and finish off Iona, a double cannon sounded, and they returned to their earlier resting place. Just north of the cornucopia, Glamour and Opal were resting within another burrow of trees. Shortly after hearing the double cannon of Eucalypta and Sandrine, they started to feel the rain from above, which at first did not affect them too badly. However, as the hour passed, they appeared more and more drenched by this rain. Glamour suggested heading to a more covered area of forest, but Opal quickly refused this idea, by stating that it was not worth the risk of going out into the open. Glamour once again became annoyed and complained about the weather, but Opal appeared to be paying no attention, as she focused on the droplets that were running down the leaves of the nearest tree. Both girls were then suddenly distracted by the double cannon of Aoife and Iona, which ended Opal's days and Glamour's monologue. Glamour asked Opal who she thought this double cannon may belong to, and Opal made a few guesses as the rainfall slowed down, and within a few minutes it had completely stopped. Glamour turned around and squeezed the moisture from her t-shirt within a patch of sunlight that had just returned through the trees above, and Opal stated that it was much easier to watch these games from home and know what was happening. She then asked Glamour if she thought her parents were having any wild viewing parties while she was in the arena. Glamour jolted around and snarled, before telling Opal that just because she had shown a moment of weakness the day before, this did not suddenly mean that they were best friends, before turning back to squeeze her t-shirt. Opal turned back and looked straight ahead once more at the droplets that were falling from the tree, without even moving her gaze as she quietly pulled a knife from her pocket.